The rain came down in sheets, hammering the empty street with a sound like static, and the woman running through it looked back over her shoulder every few seconds, as if the darkness itself was chasing her. Daniel saw her before he heard her. He was locking up the garage, his hands stiff from a 12-hour shift, when a shape burst out from the alley beside the shuttered bakery and nearly collided with him. "Please," she said, breathless, gripping his arm with a strength that surprised him. "Please, I need somewhere to go, right now." Her eyes kept flicking past him toward the street, toward the headlights sweeping the wet pavement at the far corner. Daniel followed her gaze and saw a black car slow down, its engine idling, as if the driver was searching for something. Or someone. "Who are you?" he asked, not unkindly, but firmly enough that she understood. He wasn't going to simply let a stranger vanish into his life, without a single answer. "My name is Elena," she said quickly. "That's all I can tell you tonight. I promise I'm not dangerous, but I think someone is following me, and I don't have my phone, I don't have my wallet, I don't have anything. I just need 5 minutes to think." The black car crept forward another few feet, then stopped again. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest, an instinct he couldn't explain, the kind that told him this wasn't an ordinary night, and this wasn't an ordinary woman. He had grown up in a rough part of the city. He knew the difference between someone who was lying for attention and someone who was genuinely afraid. Elena's fear was real. It was in the way her hands shook, the way her breathing hadn't slowed even after she stopped running. "Come with me," he said, and pulled his jacket off his shoulders, wrapping it around her before she could protest. "There's a diner 2 blocks that way, but we're not going that way. We're going the other way, through the back lots. Stay close." He led her through a maze of narrow passages behind the row of shops, places only locals knew existed, gaps between buildings barely wide enough for 2 people to pass through single file. Elena followed without question, her shoes splashing through puddles, her breath coming out in small clouds in the cold night air. Behind them, faintly, they heard a car door open and close, and then the low murmur of a voice speaking into a phone. "They're still looking," she whispered. "Who are they?" "I can't say. Not yet. I'm sorry." Daniel didn't push. He had learned a long time ago, from watching his mother battle illness and bills and every kind of hardship a person could face, that sometimes people needed a hand before they needed an explanation. Explanations could come later. Right now, this woman needed to get off the street. They reached his apartment building 15 minutes later, both of them soaked through, both of them glancing behind constantly, though the black car and its occupants seemed to have lost their trail somewhere in the maze of alleys. Daniel's apartment was small, the kind of place that smelled faintly of engine oil no matter how many times he cleaned it, with a single window that looked out over a parking lot and a flickering street lamp. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was safe, and right now that was everything. "You can sit," he said, gesturing to the worn couch that had been his since he moved in 3 years earlier. "I'll get you a towel." Elena sat carefully, as if she wasn't used to furniture that had seen better days, though she said nothing about it. When Daniel returned with a towel and a spare shirt that would obviously be too large for her, she thanked him with a quiet sincerity that made him pause. There was something in the way she said the words, something practiced yet raw, as though gratitude wasn't a thing she got to feel very often. "I don't have much," Daniel admitted, filling a kettle with water and setting it on the stove, "but I've got tea, and I've got a couch, and neither one of those is going anywhere tonight." "You don't even know me," Elena said. "I could be anyone. I could be dangerous. You're shaking so hard you can barely hold that towel," Daniel replied, not unkindly. "I don't think you're dangerous. I think you're scared. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face the way someone studies a puzzle they can't quite solve, and then, for the first time since he'd found her in the alley, she allowed herself something close to a smile. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that, truly." The kettle began to whistle, and Daniel busied himself pouring 2 cups of tea, giving her a moment to collect herself. Outside, the rain hadn't let up, drumming steadily against the window, and somewhere in the distance a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling before disappearing again. Elena tensed at the sound, her hand tightening around the towel, and Daniel noticed. "They won't find you here," he said, though he had no real way of knowing that for certain. "This building isn't in anyone's records. I'm not even sure the landlord remembers what floor I live on. You don't understand, Elena said quietly. If they find me, it isn't just my problem. It becomes yours too. And I don't want that for you. You've already done more than most people would. Daniel set the 2 cups of tea on the small table between them and sat down across from her, his expression steady, unshaken by her warning. Whoever's after you, whatever this is about, you're safe right now. That's what matters tonight. Tomorrow, we can figure out the rest. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers, and for the first time since the chase began, her shoulders relaxed just slightly. She glanced around the small apartment, taking in the modest furniture, the framed photograph on the shelf of a woman who was clearly Daniel's mother, the stack of unpaid bills tucked neatly but visibly beside a lamp. You work at the garage, she said, more of an observation than a question. Long hours. 12 today, sometimes more. Daniel shrugged as if it were nothing unusual, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed how much the hours weighed on him. My mother's sick. Medical bills add up fast. The garage pays enough to keep us afloat. Mostly. Mostly, Elena repeated softly, and something in her expression shifted, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps guilt, that she quickly hid behind another sip of tea. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain, each aware of the other's presence, in a way that felt strangely comfortable, despite the strangeness of the night. Daniel didn't ask more questions, and Elena didn't offer more answers, but something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that neither needed to explain themselves fully to deserve kindness. You should sleep, Daniel finally said, standing and gathering a spare blanket from the closet. Take the bed. I'll be fine out here. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I'm offering. He set the blanket down on the small bed in the adjoining room and gestured for her to follow. Get some rest. Whatever's chasing you will still be there in the morning, but at least you'll be able to face it with a clear head. Elena hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at him one more time. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You have every reason to be cautious, and instead you're giving up your bed to a stranger who won't even tell you her last name. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. Because someone did the same for me once, a long time ago, when I needed it most. I figured I'd pass it along when the chance came. She didn't respond right away, but something in her eyes softened, and she nodded once before disappearing into the small bedroom, leaving Daniel alone in the front room with 2 empty cups of tea and the steady sound of rain against the window. He checked the lock on the door twice, more out of habit than real worry, and settled onto the couch, pulling his jacket over himself like a blanket. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old building made him tense. Every distant car engine made him wonder if the black sedan had somehow found its way back. But as the hours passed and nothing happened, exhaustion finally won out, and Daniel drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that the woman sleeping in his bed carried a secret so large it would soon turn his quiet, ordinary life completely upside down. Somewhere across the city, in an office lit only by the glow of computer screens, a team of people were working through the night, running searches, making calls, tracing the last known location of a woman who was never supposed to disappear in the first place. And in a modest apartment above a closed hardware store, that same woman lay awake in the dark, listening to the rain, wondering how much longer she could keep the truth about herself hidden from the one person who had shown her more genuine kindness than she had experienced in years. Morning arrived quietly, gray light filtering through the thin curtains, and Daniel woke to the smell of tea brewing in his own kitchen. For a moment he forgot the events of the night before, until he sat up and saw Elena standing by the stove, wearing his oversized shirt, her hair still damp from the rain, looking far more composed than she had any right to after everything that happened. I hope you don't mind, she said, noticing him stir. I found the tea leaves. I wanted to do something, even something small, after everything you did for me. You didn't have to. Daniel rubbed his eyes and stood, stretching muscles still sore from the previous day's work. How did you sleep? Better than I expected, she admitted, which surprises me, considering. They sat together at the small table, sharing tea and a simple breakfast of toast, the kind of quiet domestic moment that felt strangely out of place, given the danger that had brought them together only hours earlier. Daniel noticed Elena kept glancing toward the window, her body angled slightly so she could see the parking lot without appearing to look directly at it. "Still worried they'll find you," he said. "I'm always worried about that," she replied, and there was a weight behind the words that suggested a much longer story than one night could explain. "It's become a kind of habit, a bad one. You still haven't told me who they are." Elena set down her cup and looked at him directly, weighing something in her mind before she spoke. "There are people who believe they have a right to control where I go, what I do, who I speak to. I left that behind last night, just for a few hours, because I needed to remember what it felt like to be treated like an ordinary person, instead of something to be managed and protected and watched every second of the day." "That sounds lonely," Daniel said, and he meant it. "It is." She looked down at her hands. "You have no idea how lonely it can be, having people around you constantly, and still feeling like nobody actually sees you. Last night, in that alley, in the rain, running from a car I couldn't even be sure was really following me, or if I had simply imagined it out of fear built up over years, you were the first person in longer than I can remember who looked at me and saw a person who needed help. Not a name, not a reputation, just a person." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that, so instead he simply nodded, letting the silence between them carry the weight of understanding, rather than filling it with empty words. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street below, and both of them tensed at the sound, before realizing it was only a delivery truck making its rounds. "I should get to the garage soon," Daniel said eventually, checking the time on the small clock above his stove. "But I don't like leaving you here alone if there's any real danger. If you want, you can stay until I'm back this evening. Or if you'd rather, I can walk you somewhere else, somewhere you feel is safer." Elena considered the offer for a long moment. "Would it be a burden staying here? I promise I won't touch anything I shouldn't, and I'll be gone the moment I figure out how to safely reach someone I trust." "It's not a burden," Daniel said, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. There was something about her presence, something calm beneath the fear, that made the small apartment feel less empty than it usually did. Before he left for his shift, Daniel showed her where to find food, explained how the old radiator worked when the mornings turned cold, and left a spare key on the table in case she needed to step out and lock the door behind her. Elena watched him gather his things with an expression he couldn't quite place, somewhere between gratitude and something heavier, something that looked almost like guilt. "Thank you," she said again, as he opened the door to leave. "For all of this, I won't forget it." "Just stay safe," Daniel replied, and then he was gone, off into the gray morning to spend another long day, bent over engines and exhaust pipes, his mind occasionally drifting back to the strange woman he had left alone in his apartment, wondering if she would still be there when he returned. The day passed slowly for Daniel, filled with the usual demands of the garage, customers complaining about repair costs, his manager pushing him to finish jobs faster than seemed reasonable, and beneath it all, a persistent thread of worry about Elena. He found himself checking his phone during breaks, though he had no way to reach her. No number, no way of knowing if she was safe, or if the people chasing her the night before had somehow found their way to his apartment while he was away. Meanwhile, in a very different part of the city, a very different kind of day was unfolding. In a tall glass building overlooking the river, a team of security professionals worked with barely contained tension, poring over camera footage, tracing the last confirmed sighting of a young woman who mattered a great deal more than her simple first name suggested. Phones rang constantly. Voices were kept low but urgent. A man named Marcus, the head of this particular security detail, stood at the center of it all, reviewing grainy footage of a woman running through rain-soaked streets before disappearing into an alley that the cameras couldn't follow. "She was here just after midnight," Marcus said, pointing to a timestamp on the screen. And then nothing. No card transactions, no phone activity, nothing on any camera within 6 blocks. "She's resourceful," said a woman beside him, scrolling through additional footage on a separate monitor. "She's done this before, slipping away, but never for this long. Something's different this time." "Or someone helped her," Marcus said quietly, almost to himself, studying a blurry frame that showed, for just a fraction of a second, a young man's figure moving alongside her before both vanished from the camera's view entirely. He zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed, but the image remained too indistinct to identify anyone with certainty. Still, it was something, A lead, however small. "Should we widen the search radius?" the woman asked. "Widen it, and pull footage from every business within a mile of that alley. If someone helped her last night, I want to know who they are before the family finds out how long she's actually been missing." By early afternoon, the search had narrowed considerably. A traffic camera 3 streets from the alley had captured a partial image of a man in a garage uniform walking alongside a woman, matching Elena's height and build, both of them moving quickly, both glancing behind themselves in a manner that suggested urgency rather than a casual evening walk. Marcus enlarged the image as far as the resolution allowed, studying the faded lettering stitched across the man's jacket, a logo he didn't recognize but that one of his junior analysts identified within the hour as belonging to a small, independently owned garage on the edge of the neighborhood. "Get me every employee roster from that garage for the past 2 years, Marcus instructed, already reaching for his coat, "and pull property records for anyone within a 6-block radius who matches. If she's sheltering with someone, it's someone local, someone who wouldn't draw attention simply by having an unfamiliar face come and go." The work was tedious, methodical, the kind of investigation that relied far more on patience than drama, cross-referencing employment records against apartment leases, narrowing dozens of possibilities down to a handful, then finally to a single name that matched every detail available to them. By late afternoon, Marcus had an address, a photograph pulled from an old employment file, and a growing certainty that the young mechanic in the picture was, in fact, the same man who had walked beside Elena through the rain. He debated, for a longer moment than his position usually allowed him, whether to move immediately or to wait, to observe the address quietly first, and confirm before alerting the rest of the family's security apparatus. In the end, caution won out. He dispatched a single car to watch the building discreetly, with instructions to report any movement, but to make no direct contact until he arrived personally. Whatever this mechanic's involvement in Elena's disappearance actually was, whether accidental or something more deliberate, Marcus intended to understand the full situation himself before anyone else had the chance to complicate it. Back at the apartment, Elena spent the day in quiet reflection, moving carefully around the small space, careful not to disturb anything, careful to keep the curtains drawn just enough to avoid being seen from the street below. She found herself drawn to the photograph on the shelf, the same one she had noticed the night before, of an older woman with tired but kind eyes, clearly Daniel's mother. Beside the photograph sat a small stack of medical paperwork, folded neatly, the kind of documents that told a quiet story of struggle without a single word needing to be spoken aloud. She thought about her own life, the mansion she had grown up in, the private tutors, the security details that followed her from the moment she woke until the moment she fell asleep, and she felt an unfamiliar pang of something like envy toward the simple, difficult, honest life reflected in this small apartment. There was a rawness here, a realness, that felt entirely absent from the polished world she had left behind, even if only for a single night. By late afternoon, restlessness set in, and Elena found herself standing near the window, watching the street below, when she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. A car, dark and unremarkable except for the way it lingered at the corner far longer than any ordinary vehicle should, its engine idling, its windows tinted just enough to obscure whoever sat inside. She stepped back from the window quickly, her heart pounding, wondering if this was simply her fear playing tricks on her, or if the search for her had somehow drawn closer than she had hoped. She waited, watching from a safer angle, and after several long minutes the car pulled away, disappearing around the corner without incident. Still, the encounter left her shaken, and she found herself pacing the small apartment, torn between the instinct to run again, to disappear somewhere even the most determined search team couldn't follow, and the growing reluctance to leave without at least thanking Daniel properly for everything he had done. When Daniel finally returned that evening, exhausted and smelling faintly of motor oil, he found Elena sitting at the small table, a troubled expression on her face that hadn't been there when he left that morning. "Something happened," he said, setting down his bag and studying her closely. "What is it?" "I saw a car outside earlier," she admitted. "It might have been nothing, but it might not have been." Daniel felt the same cold unease from the night before settle back into his chest. "Did they see you? Did they come to the door?" "No. It drove away eventually. But Daniel, I think I need to leave. Tonight, if possible. I've already put you in enough danger just by being here, and if they're getting close, I don't want you caught in the middle of something that isn't yours to carry. Where would you even go? Daniel asked, genuine concern in his voice. You don't have a phone, you don't have money, you don't have anywhere safe to stay except here. If they're really out there searching every corner of the city, running out into the open again seems more dangerous than staying put. Elena hesitated, clearly torn between the practical truth of his words and the fear that had been building inside her all day. You don't understand what you'd be risking by letting me stay. Then help me understand, Daniel said, sitting down across from her, his voice steady and patient despite the exhaustion written across his face. You keep saying there are people looking for you, that it's dangerous, that I don't understand the risk, but you still haven't told me anything real. I'm not asking because I'm nosy. I'm asking because I want to actually help you, and it's hard to help someone when you're working with half the picture. For a long moment, Elena said nothing, staring down at her hands folded on the table, clearly wrestling with some internal decision. When she finally looked up, there was something different in her eyes, a kind of resolve that hadn't been there the night before. My family is very well known, she said slowly, choosing her words with obvious care, not in an ordinary way, in a way that makes people want things from us, sometimes in ways that aren't safe. I left because I needed one night, just one, to feel like a normal person, instead of someone constantly being watched, managed, and protected. I never meant to put you at risk. I only meant to disappear for a few hours, and then quietly find my way back, before anyone noticed I was gone. But someone noticed, Daniel said. Someone always notices, Elena replied, a trace of old exhaustion in her voice. That's the price of the life I live. I just didn't expect it to catch up with me so quickly. Daniel studied her for a long moment, turning the fragments of information over in his mind, though he still didn't have anything close to the full picture. Still, something in her tone, the practiced caution, the weight of years spent guarding herself from a world that wanted pieces of her, made him believe every word, even without the details to back it up. Stay tonight, he said finally. We'll figure out a safer plan in the morning, when we're both thinking more clearly. Running out into the dark with no phone and no money isn't a plan. It's just fear making the decision for you. Elena studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she nodded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. All right, she said quietly. One more night. But Daniel, if anything happens, if they come here looking for me, you need to promise me you'll say you don't know anything. Protect yourself first, please. I'm not going to make that promise, Daniel said simply, and something about the quiet certainty in his voice left no room for argument. But I appreciate the thought. They spent the rest of the evening in a strange, comfortable quiet, sharing a simple dinner, talking about small things, favorite foods, childhood memories, careful to avoid anything that might draw them back into the tension of Elena's hidden world. For a few hours, it almost felt like an ordinary evening between two ordinary people, and Daniel found himself grateful for the illusion, even knowing it couldn't last. Neither of them noticed the black car that returned just after midnight, parking a block further away this time, its occupants watching the building with patient, practiced attention, waiting for the right moment to make their move. An hour before that knock came, a different sound had already pulled Daniel halfway out of sleep, the low crunch of tires rolling slowly over wet gravel in the parking lot below his window. He lay still on the couch, listening, telling himself it was nothing. A neighbor coming home late, a delivery truck lost on the wrong street. But the sound didn't fade the way ordinary traffic usually did. It stopped, and stayed stopped, directly beneath his building. He rose quietly and crossed to the window, careful to keep himself in shadow, and looked down at the lot. 2 cars now sat there, engines off, doors closed, no one visible moving toward the entrance yet. It was the stillness that unsettled him most, the sense of people waiting rather than arriving, watching rather than approaching. He thought of waking Elena immediately, then decided against it, not wanting to frighten her over something that might still turn out to be nothing. He was wrong to wait, though only slightly. 10 minutes later, a third car pulled up, this one moving with less caution than the others, and a man stepped out quickly, glancing up at the row of windows along the building's face, with the particular intensity of someone hunting for a specific light, a specific silhouette. Daniel recognized, even from that distance, that this man moved differently than the 2 vehicles that had arrived first. less patient, less practiced, more like someone chasing a story than protecting a person, a photographer perhaps, or worse, someone hoping to profit from finding Elena before her own people did. He woke her then, quietly, a hand light on her shoulder, and explained what he had seen. Elena's face tightened with the particular fear of someone who understood, better than Daniel could, the difference between the security team sent to bring her home safely and the opportunists who sometimes moved faster, driven by very different motives. "If that's who I think it is," she whispered, pulling her borrowed shirt tighter around herself, "then whatever pictures he takes, whatever story he sells, it won't be gentle, and it won't be accurate. We need to think carefully before anyone opens that door." They stayed low, away from the windows, weighing whether to slip out through the back stairwell immediately, or wait to see which of the 3 cars approached first. It was several tense minutes before the photographer, apparently unable to confirm which unit held his target, retreated to his car and remained there, watching, waiting for daylight or for someone else's mistake to reveal the answer for him. Only then did the calmer, more controlled approach begin. Footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried, leading at last to the knock that finally announced itself properly at the door. The knock came just before 2 in the morning, 3 sharp raps against the door that pulled Daniel out of a shallow sleep and sent his heart racing before his mind had even fully caught up. He sat up on the couch, listening, and heard it again, louder this time, followed by a voice, calm and professional, speaking through the door. "We know someone is inside. We're not here to cause trouble. We only need to speak with the woman." Elena appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, her face pale in the dim light, one hand pressed against the frame as if to steady herself. "They found us," she whispered. "Stay back," Daniel said quietly, moving toward the door but not opening it. "Who's there?" "My name is Marcus," the voice answered, still calm, still measured. "I work for the family of the woman inside. I promise you, I'm not here to hurt anyone. I only need to confirm she's safe and bring her home." "How do I know that's true?" Daniel asked, glancing back at Elena, who shook her head frantically, silently pleading with him not to open the door. "You don't," Marcus admitted through the door, "but consider this. If I wanted to force my way in, I would have already. I'm asking, not demanding. That should tell you something." Elena crossed the small room quickly and pressed her mouth close to Daniel's ear. "Don't let him in," she whispered. "Not yet. I need a few more minutes to think." Daniel nodded and raised his voice toward the door. "Give us a minute." There was a pause, then Marcus's voice again, still even, still patient. "Take your time, but understand, the longer this takes, the more people will start arriving outside this building, and that's not going to be easier for either of you." Elena pulled Daniel further into the room, away from the door, her voice barely above a breath. "If it really is Marcus, he works for my family's security team. He's not violent, but he won't leave without me, not now that he's found this address. I think our best option now is to go with him, calmly, and figure out the rest from a position of safety, rather than running again." "Are you sure?" Daniel asked. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to. I'm sure it's the safer choice for both of us," Elena said, glancing toward the window, where the faint outline of a second car was now visible parked across the street, its headlights off, its presence unmistakable. "If I keep running, this only gets worse, and it starts pulling you deeper into something that was never your responsibility." Daniel took a slow breath, weighing the decision, and then walked back to the door and unlocked it. The man standing on the other side was tall, dressed in a simple dark coat, his expression calm but alert, the kind of composure that came from years of managing difficult situations, without letting emotion take control. Behind him stood 2 other figures, quieter, watching the hallway rather than the apartment itself. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly at the sight of her standing safely behind Daniel. "You had everyone very worried." "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly. "I needed some time. I should have found a better way to take it." Marcus's eyes moved briefly to Daniel, assessing him with the careful attention of someone whose job depended on reading people quickly and accurately. "You helped her," he said. "It wasn't a question." "She needed help," Daniel replied simply. "I wasn't going to just walk past." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flicker of genuine respect beneath the professional calm. Not many people would have done that, not without knowing who she was, or what it might cost them. I didn't need to know who she was, Daniel said. She needed help. That was enough. Elena stepped forward, placing a hand briefly on Daniel's arm before turning back to Marcus. He kept me safe all night. He didn't ask questions he didn't need to ask, and he never once made me feel like a burden. Whatever happens next, I want that on record. Marcus nodded slowly, clearly recalibrating whatever assumptions he had walked in with. Understood, but we do need to move quickly. The family has been informed of the search, and given the sensitivity involved, the fewer people who know the details of tonight, the safer it will be. For everyone involved, including him. What does that mean exactly? Daniel asked, a note of wariness entering his voice for the first time since the door had opened. It means, Marcus said carefully, that discretion matters a great deal in situations like this. There will likely be questions, perhaps some public attention, given how visible the family is. I'd advise you to be prepared for that, though we'll do what we can to manage it responsibly. Elena turned to Daniel, her expression a complicated mixture of gratitude and worry. I never wanted to bring this kind of attention into your life. That was never the plan. It's all right, Daniel said, though a small knot of uncertainty had begun forming in his stomach at the mention of public attention. Whatever happens, happens. You're safe. That's what mattered most tonight. Marcus gestured toward the door, his manner still calm but with an underlying urgency that suggested time was now a factor. We should go. The car outside will take us somewhere more private to sort out the details, and I promise you, Daniel, someone will be in touch soon to properly thank you for what you did. Elena hesitated at the doorway, turning back one last time to look at Daniel, standing in the small apartment that had sheltered her through the most frightening night of recent memory. Thank you, she said again, the words carrying far more weight now than they had the night before. I won't forget this. I promise you that. Stay safe, Daniel said, echoing the words he had offered her the previous morning, though this time they carried the finality of a real goodbye, rather than a temporary parting. And then she was gone, disappearing into the hallway with Marcus and the two quiet figures who had accompanied him, leaving Daniel alone once more in the small apartment, the door closing softly behind them. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where she had been, half wondering if the entire night had simply been an elaborate dream brought on by exhaustion and too little sleep. But the folded blanket still sat on his bed, the two empty teacups still rested on the small table, and the lingering scent of rain still clung faintly to the air, proof that everything had, in fact, been real. Daniel didn't sleep much for the remainder of the night, his mind turning over the strange sequence of events, the mysterious woman, the calm but clearly serious man named Marcus, and the vague but unsettling mention of public attention. He told himself it would pass, that whoever Elena truly was, whatever world she belonged to, it existed separately from his own quiet, difficult life, and that once the immediate danger passed, things would simply return to normal. He was wrong. By the time the sun rose fully over the city, casting long golden light across the wet streets, a different kind of storm was already gathering, one that had nothing to do with rain and everything to do with the sudden, undeniable connection between an ordinary mechanic and a young woman whose real name, it turned out, belonged to one of the most recognized families in the entire country. The first sign came just after 7 in the morning, when Daniel's phone, usually silent except for the occasional message from a coworker, began buzzing with an unfamiliar number, then another, then several more in quick succession. He ignored the calls at first, assuming they were spam, until a text message finally broke through his uncertainty, sent from a number he didn't recognize. This is Marcus. I need you to be prepared. Word is beginning to spread faster than we anticipated. Please stay inside if possible, and don't speak to anyone from the media until we can help manage the situation properly. Daniel read the message twice, confusion giving way slowly to a creeping sense of alarm. He walked to the window and looked down at the street below, and what he saw made his stomach drop entirely. Where the previous night had held only 2 quiet, unremarkable cars, the street below was now lined with vehicles, several of them marked with the logos of local news stations, others simply unmarked cars with people standing beside them holding cameras and microphones, all of them positioned with clear purpose, all of them watching his building. He stepped back from the window quickly, his heart pounding, the reality of the situation finally beginning to settle over him. Whatever Elena's secret truly was, It was far larger than he had imagined, and it was about to change his quiet, ordinary life in ways he was only beginning to understand. His phone buzzed again, another message from Marcus, shorter this time, more urgent. Do not open the door. We are sending someone to help you leave safely through another exit. Stay calm. This will be resolved, but it will take some time. Daniel set the phone down on the table with hands that weren't entirely steady, and for the first time since the strange encounter in the alley 2 nights earlier, he allowed himself to fully consider the question that had been quietly building in the back of his mind since Marcus first appeared at his door. Who exactly was Elena, and what kind of world had he unknowingly stepped into by simply choosing to help a stranger in the rain? The name arrived within the hour, delivered not by Marcus, but by a news alert that lit up Daniel's phone screen with a headline he had to read 3 times before the words truly settled in his mind. Elena Whitmore, heiress to the Whitmore Group, one of the largest technology and infrastructure companies in the country, had been found safe after nearly 40 hours missing, following what officials were calling a voluntary but deeply concerning disappearance. The article included a photograph, polished and formal, nothing like the soaked, frightened woman who had collapsed into his life 2 nights earlier, yet undeniably the same person. Daniel sat frozen at his small table, staring at the image on his phone, piecing together fragments of conversation that suddenly made a different kind of sense. The mention of family, the careful avoidance of details, the quiet, practiced way she carried herself even in fear, as though some part of her had been trained since childhood to remain composed no matter the circumstance. He thought of the framed photograph on his shelf, of his mother's tired face, and felt an odd, dizzying contrast settle over him, the gap between his modest apartment and the world Elena Whitmore actually belonged to suddenly feeling immense and impossible to fully grasp. Outside, the crowd along the street had grown larger, and now, faintly, he could hear voices calling up toward the building, questions shouted toward windows that had no answers to give. His phone buzzed again, another message from Marcus. Someone is coming to the service entrance in the back. Pack only what you need. We'll move you somewhere quiet until this settles. Daniel hesitated only a moment before gathering a small bag, his mind still spinning from the revelation, and made his way down the narrow back stairwell of the building, the kind rarely used except by maintenance workers, until he reached a plain gray car, waiting exactly where the message had described. A young man he didn't recognize opened the door for him without a word, and within minutes they were pulling away from the chaos surrounding his building, weaving through side streets until the noise of shouting reporters faded entirely behind them. The place they brought him to was nothing like his apartment, a quiet townhouse on a tree-lined street, the kind of neighborhood where the houses looked freshly painted and the lawns were trimmed with careful precision. Marcus met him at the door, his expression apologetic in a way that felt genuine despite the professional composure he maintained. I'm sorry for the disruption, Marcus said, leading him inside to a comfortable sitting room. We didn't anticipate the story breaking quite this quickly, but once local reporters connected the location of the disappearance to your neighborhood, it moved fast. You could have told me who she really was, Daniel said, still processing everything, his voice not accusatory, but tired, overwhelmed. It wasn't my place to reveal that, Marcus replied honestly. That was Elena's decision to make, in her own time. I understand it's a great deal to take in all at once. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Elena appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, dressed now in simple, elegant clothing that still somehow felt more like a costume than the borrowed shirt she had worn in his apartment. She looked different, more composed, more careful in her movements. Yet the moment her eyes met Daniel's, something familiar passed between them, the same quiet understanding that had formed during their long night together. Daniel, she said softly, stepping into the room. I'm so sorry for everything this has put you through. I never meant for any of this to touch your life. You could have told me, Daniel said, echoing his words to Marcus, though softer now, less an accusation, and more a genuine question. Why didn't you? Elena sat down across from him, folding her hands carefully in her lap, choosing her words with the same deliberate care she had shown throughout their entire encounter. Because for one night, I wanted someone to help me simply because I needed help, not because of who my family is, not because of what helping me might gain them. You looked at me in that alley and saw a frightened stranger, nothing more. And that was the first time in longer than I can remember that someone treated me as simply human. If I had told you the truth immediately, I worried everything would have changed. The way you looked at me, the way you spoke to me, all of it. It wouldn't have changed anything, Daniel said quietly, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't entirely certain that was true, given the strange, overwhelming reality now surrounding him. Perhaps not, Elena said, but I couldn't have known that beforehand, and I didn't want to risk finding out the wrong answer while I was already at my most vulnerable. Marcus, sensing the personal weight of the conversation, quietly excused himself from the room, leaving the two of them alone amid the comfortable, unfamiliar furnishings of the townhouse. Outside, faintly, they could still hear the distant hum of the city, though the immediate chaos surrounding Daniel's building felt worlds away now. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. "For me, I mean. My mother, my job, my apartment. Everything you just described, the attention, the cameras, it's not something I know how to navigate." Elena's expression softened with genuine concern. "I've already spoken with our family's legal and communications team. They're prepared to help manage the public attention on your behalf, to protect your privacy as much as possible, and to make sure none of this creates hardship for you or your mother. I know that might sound like an empty promise given everything that's happened, but I intend to make good on it personally, not simply hand it off to be forgotten once the story fades from the news." "I don't need anything from you," Daniel said, though there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet insistence on the same principle that had guided him from the very beginning. "I helped you because you needed help, not for anything in return." "I know that," Elena said, and something in her voice carried real emotion now, a rawness that hadn't been present in her earlier, more careful explanations. "That's exactly why I want to help you now, precisely because you never expected or asked for anything. People rarely offer kindness that pure in my experience, and I don't intend to simply walk away from it as though it meant nothing." Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus returning to the doorway, his expression carrying a new layer of urgency. "Elena, your father has arrived. He's asking to see you immediately." Elena's posture shifted almost instantly, the softness in her expression replaced by something more guarded, more practiced, the same composure Daniel had first witnessed on the edges of the photograph in the news article. "I need to speak with him," she said, standing. "Daniel, please, stay here. I promise I'll return as soon as I can, and we'll figure out the rest together." She left the room quickly, and Daniel was left once more in unfamiliar surroundings, the weight of the entire situation settling more heavily over him with each passing minute. Through the sitting room window, he caught a brief glimpse of a tall, silver-haired man striding purposefully into the house, flanked by 2 additional security personnel, his expression severe, his presence commanding, in a way that made even Marcus straighten slightly as he passed. Raised voices drifted faintly from another room, muffled by walls and distance but unmistakable in tone, an argument unfolding somewhere deeper in the house. Daniel couldn't make out specific words, only the rhythm of tension, a father's frustration meeting a daughter's quiet but firm resistance. He sat alone in the sitting room for what felt like a very long time, uncertain whether he should remain seated or attempt to make himself useful in some way, uncertain in truth of almost everything happening around him. When Elena finally returned, nearly an hour later, her expression carried a complicated mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She sat down across from Daniel once more, taking a slow breath before speaking. "My father is concerned, understandably, about how quickly this story has spread, and about protecting the family's reputation," she said carefully. "He wanted to handle your involvement quietly, to compensate you generously, in exchange for signing documents, agreeing never to speak publicly about what happened." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest at the mention of compensation, an old instinct toward pride, mixing uncomfortably with practical awareness of his own financial struggles. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that's not what I want," Elena said firmly. "You didn't help me for money, and I refuse to reduce what you did to a transaction that can simply be paid off and forgotten. I told him I intend to acknowledge publicly and honestly what happened, and why, without turning you into either a headline or a secret to be managed." "That can't have gone over well," Daniel said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face for the first time since the chaos of the morning began. "It didn't," Elena admitted, matching his smile with one of her own, though hers carried more exhaustion than humor. "But it's my decision to make, not his, regardless of how uncomfortable that makes certain people. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of quiet conversations, careful planning between Elena, Marcus, and a small team of communications advisors who arrived shortly after her father's departure, all of them working to construct a plan that would address the public's growing curiosity honestly, while still protecting both Elena's safety and Daniel's ordinary, previously private life. Daniel found himself included in these conversations more than he expected, his opinions genuinely sought rather than simply managed, a small but meaningful gesture that told him Elena's earlier promise carried real weight behind it. Midway through the afternoon, Marcus returned to the sitting room carrying a tablet, his expression graver than it had been since Daniel first met him. "There's something you both need to see," he said, setting the screen between them. A gossip website, one with a reputation for paying for exactly the kind of photograph that could ruin a carefully managed story, had posted a blurry image taken from across the street outside Daniel's apartment building, time-stamped at just past 2 in the morning. The photograph showed little, only 2 indistinct shapes near a doorway, but the accompanying article was already speculating wildly, weaving a version of events that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. "That's him," Daniel said quietly, recognizing the angle, remembering the man who had stepped out of the third car and stared up at the building's windows in the dark, the one who arrived before Marcus did. "He's freelance," Marcus explained, scrolling through the article with visible frustration. "Not connected to any single outlet, which makes him harder to negotiate with directly. He'll sell to whoever pays the most. And right now, given the size of this story, that's likely to be several outlets at once, each publishing a slightly different, slightly wrong version of the same few blurry images." Elena's jaw tightened as she read further down the article, where anonymous sources speculated about the nature of her relationship with the stranger from the alley, in terms that were, at best, careless with the truth. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," she said. "Not the attention itself, but this, people inventing a story because the real one hasn't been told yet. Then we tell it first," Daniel said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his own voice. "Properly, before he sells any more pictures and before anyone else gets to decide what actually happened that night." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, a flicker of genuine approval crossing his usually guarded expression. "That's not a bad instinct. Most people in your position would want to disappear from this entirely. You're choosing to walk toward it instead. I'm not going to let a stranger with a camera decide who Elena is, or who I am, based on 2 blurry photographs taken from across a parking lot," Daniel said. "If the truth is going to come out anyway, it should come out honestly, from the people who actually lived it." Elena looked at him with something close to wonder, as though she were seeing, for the first time since the townhouse door had closed behind them, the full measure of the quiet resolve that had carried him through the entire ordeal, without once wavering. "Then we'll do exactly that," she said, turning back to Marcus. "Arrange the statement, but we do it on our terms, in our words, not filtered through someone else's version of events." By evening, as the light outside the townhouse windows began to fade into the soft colors of dusk, a rough plan had taken shape, one that would require Daniel to step, at least briefly, into a spotlight he had never sought and never wanted, though the alternative, allowing rumors and half-truths to spread unchecked, seemed far worse than facing the truth directly. "Are you certain about this?" Daniel asked Elena, as the advisors finally left the room to prepare statements for the following day. "Once this becomes public, truly public, there's no taking it back." "I'm certain," Elena said, meeting his eyes with the same steady conviction she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, from the moment she first grabbed his arm in the rain-soaked alley, to this quiet evening now surrounding them. "You gave me something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine kindness, with nothing expected in return. The least I can do now is make sure the world understands that truth clearly, rather than letting it become twisted into something smaller and less meaningful than it actually was." Neither of them could have fully anticipated, in that quiet moment, just how much attention the coming days would bring, nor how thoroughly Daniel's simple, hard-working life was about to be examined, questioned, and ultimately reshaped by a single act of kindness, offered freely on an ordinary rainy night. The press conference took place 3 days later, in a modest room chosen specifically for its lack of grandeur. a deliberate decision Elena had insisted upon against the advice of nearly every advisor in the room. She wanted the setting to reflect the truth of the story, not the wealth surrounding it. And so instead of the marble hallways of the Whitmore corporate headquarters, reporters gathered in a simple community hall, not far from the neighborhood where Daniel's small apartment still stood. Daniel sat beside Elena at a plain table, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his discomfort with the rows of cameras and waiting reporters evident despite his attempt to appear composed. His mother sat in the front row, her frail hands gripping her cane, her eyes bright with a mixture of pride and worry that Daniel found more grounding than anything else in the overwhelming room. Elena spoke first, her voice steady despite the obvious pressure of the moment, explaining honestly, and without excessive detail, the reasons behind her brief disappearance, the exhaustion of a life lived entirely under observation, and the simple, unexpected kindness of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. She spoke plainly, avoiding the polished language typically associated with her family's public statements, and something in her honesty seemed to settle the room, softening the sharp edges of curiosity into something closer to genuine interest. "Daniel didn't know who I was," she said, glancing briefly at him before continuing. "He didn't check my background. He didn't calculate what helping me might cost him or gain him. He simply saw someone in need and responded the way any good person should, without hesitation, without condition. That kind of character is rare, and I refuse to let it be reduced to a rumor or a headline stripped of its actual meaning." When it came time for Daniel to speak, his voice was quieter, less practiced, but carried its own kind of steady honesty that resonated through the room in a way polished statements often failed to achieve. "I've worked hard my whole life," he said simply. "My mother taught me that helping people isn't something you do because of who they are or what they can offer you. You do it because it's the right thing to do, and because someday, in some way, you hope someone would do the same for you or for the people you love. That's all this was. A woman needed help. I helped her. Nothing about that changes, just because of who she turned out to be." The room remained quiet for a moment after he finished speaking, the simplicity of his words carrying more weight than any carefully crafted statement could have achieved. Questions followed, some pointed, some curious, but Elena and Daniel navigated them together, honestly and without pretense, until the conference gradually drew to its natural close. In the weeks that followed, the initial wave of media attention slowly began to fade, as it always eventually does, replaced by newer stories and fresher headlines. But something had permanently shifted, both in Daniel's quiet life and in the wider public understanding of the Whitmore family's carefully guarded world. Elena made good on her promise, ensuring that Daniel's mother received access to specialists and treatment that had previously been financially out of reach, not as a transaction disguised as generosity, but as a genuine extension of gratitude freely given. Daniel, for his part, refused any offer of significant financial compensation for himself, though he eventually accepted a position within a newly established community foundation that Elena launched in the months following her return, an organization dedicated to supporting exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous struggles that had shaped his own life: medical debt, housing insecurity, the countless invisible burdens carried by people working hard simply to stay afloat. It felt right to him, a way of extending the same kindness he had offered Elena that rainy night to countless others who might never make headlines but who deserved help all the same. Elena visited the garage occasionally in the months that followed, arriving without security details or announcement, simply as a visitor, and the two of them would talk over cups of coffee, much the way they had shared tea that first strange, frightening night. Their friendship deepened slowly, built not on the foundation of her family's wealth or his sudden, unwanted fame, but on the simple mutual respect formed during those first uncertain hours, when neither of them fully understood who the other truly was. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked him once, nearly 6 months after that first rain-soaked night, as they sat together on the same worn couch in his small apartment, the same couch he had slept on that very first evening. "Helping me, I mean. Given everything it brought into your life." Daniel considered the question seriously before answering, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "No," he said finally. "Not for a single moment. My mother is healthier now than she's been in years. I found work that actually feels meaningful, helping people the way someone once helped me when I needed it most. And I gained a friend I never expected, Someone who taught me that even the people who seem to have everything are sometimes just as lonely, just as in need of simple kindness as anyone else. Elena smiled at that, a genuine, unguarded expression that felt entirely different from the careful composure she had once worn like armor before that fateful night. "I used to think my life was defined by what I had," she said quietly. "Security, wealth, a name that opened every door. But that night taught me something I hadn't understood until I lost it all temporarily, even by choice. What actually matters is far simpler than any of that. It's the willingness of one person to help another, expecting nothing in return, simply because it's the right thing to do." Outside the window, rain had begun to fall again, gentle this time, nothing like the fierce storm that had brought them together, and Daniel found himself thinking back to that first frightened glance she had given him in the alley, the desperate grip of her hand on his arm, the instinct that told him, without any real evidence, that helping her was simply the right choice regardless of consequence. He had been right, he realized now, though not in any way he could have anticipated that night. The consequences had reshaped his entire life, brought unexpected attention, unexpected opportunity, and an unexpected friendship that continued to grow stronger with each passing month. But beneath all of that change, the core truth remained exactly as it had been from the very beginning, simple and unshaken by everything that followed. A year passed, and with it came a kind of quiet transformation neither of them could have predicted that first rainy night. The foundation Elena had launched grew steadily, expanding beyond the neighborhood where Daniel's garage sat, to reach families in similar situations across the city, then across neighboring towns, each success story quietly echoing the same principle that had brought Daniel and Elena together in the first place. Daniel found himself traveling occasionally now, visiting families the foundation had helped, listening to their stories, offering the same steady, unhurried kindness that had once carried a frightened stranger safely through a single terrifying night. His mother's health continued to improve under proper care, enough that she was able to attend the foundation's first anniversary gathering, held not in a grand hall but in the same modest community center where the original press conference had taken place. She sat beside Elena that evening, the two of them talking easily, as though they had known each other for years rather than months, while Daniel watched from across the room, still faintly amazed at how far a single choice on a rain-soaked night had carried all of them. "You look happy," Elena said later, finding him near the refreshment table, watching the room fill with people whose lives, in one way or another, had been touched by the foundation's work. "I am," Daniel admitted. "It's strange, thinking back to that night. If you'd told me then that helping a stranger in an alley would lead to any of this, I don't think I would have believed you. I don't think either of us could have imagined it," Elena said, smiling. "But I've stopped being surprised by what happens when people choose kindness without expecting anything back. It has a way of finding its way forward, further than anyone ever intends." Daniel nodded, watching his mother laugh at something across the room, watching strangers who had once been helped by the foundation, now helping to organize the evening's small celebration, an unbroken chain of ordinary generosity, stretching outward in ways neither of them could have mapped in advance. A woman needed help one rainy night, and a man who had very little to offer gave what he could, freely and without hesitation. Everything that followed, the danger, the secrets, the sudden collision of two entirely different worlds, had only proven what Daniel already believed, long before he ever learned Elena's real name. Kindness offered without condition has a way of returning, in forms far larger and more meaningful than anyone could ever predict, reshaping not just one life but many, quietly, steadily, one honest choice at a time. And so, in the modest apartment above the closed hardware store, in the quiet garage where Daniel still worked most days despite everything that had changed around him, and in the growing foundation now helping countless families who might otherwise have gone unnoticed, the story of one rainy night continued to unfold, not as a single dramatic moment frozen in time, but as the steady, ongoing proof that genuine kindness, offered without knowing what it might cost or gain, remains one of the most powerful forces any person can offer another.